Why we're here today, Mr. Speaker, is to speak to my first private member's bill, Bill C-377, the Need to Know, an act to amend the Parliament of Canada Act. So what I'm going to cover, Mr. Speaker, is what will this bill do, what it isn't, and most importantly, the why. Not only to address the threats to our democracy, but to minimize the politicization around national security in this country. Where I'm coming from, Mr. Speaker, I've been dealing with classified information for over 25 years. Specifically, highly classified information since 2007, my first tour in Afghanistan, dealing with the incredible electronic warfare capabilities and signals intelligence capabilities that we possess within the military. And I've had the pleasure to sit for the last couple of years on the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. But this issue is something that's been imperative to me years before I was elected. So what is this bill? Literally, the crux of this is one sentence. The bill is really only one sentence. A member of the Senate or the House of Commons who applies for a secret security clearance from the Government of Canada is, for the purposes of the consideration of their application, deemed to need access to the information and with respect from what that application is made. So what does this mean? Well, ultimately, this just means that for the purposes of applying for the security clearance, they have a need to know. It doesn't mean that they will have access to classified information, and I'll get into that later. But why is this bill so important to be passed? Ultimately, it's to improve transparency and accountability, education, not only about the ever-changing threats to Canada and our democratic institutions and processes, but really education to Canadians and parliamentarians, and ultimately to rebuild trust in our democratic processes and institutions. So I'm going to try to explain this in the rest of my speech, Mr. Speaker, through really the lengthy preamble. The preamble is much longer in this speech than the actual bill itself. So the first paragraph is, whereas members of the Senate and the House of Commons play a key role in holding the Government of Canada to account, and in order to be able to fulfill that role, they must have sufficient access to critical information, including the facts and rationale underlying key government decisions. Let's just take testimony at PROC in the recent weeks. We have Vincent Rigby, who served as the National Security and Intelligence Advisor from January of 2020 to June of 2021. He's quoted as, transparency needs to be increased by producing annual public threat assessments, responding to the NSICOP reports, publishing intelligence priorities, and most importantly, sharing more intelligence with members of Parliament. Wesley Wark at the same committee, in his testimony, in his view, Canadians lack literacy about national security, a deficiency which could be improved by holding public hearings on national security, as these could increase public understanding and education about this aspects of government. I would argue this is bigger than just the Canadian population. This is about Parliament too, as the representatives of Canada, both elected here in the House and those appointed in the other place. I'll get more into how Parliament and the government have handled highly publicized issues a bit later in my speech. The next paragraph of the preamble of the bill, whereas the Government of Canada typically restricts access to classified information to individuals who pass a personal security screening process and who need access to the information in order to perform their official duties, i.e. the need to know principle. So what is need to know and how does it work? How does it work? How do we protect our classified information in this country? Well, first off, you have to be in a job. You have to have a reason to do it, and that's really ultimately why I'm bringing this speech forward, is to have that debate and make the case that Parliament has a need to know. Not all the time and not to everything, but that we as parliamentarians have a need to know. But just because you have that need to know, you actually got to demonstrate that you're trustworthy, and that's done through the security clearance process. When you apply for that security clearance process, again, depending upon the level, it's actually a very arduous process, or it can be. In fact, it's something I could give you a whole multi-hour speech on how we need to improve this processing of security clearances in this country. But ultimately, you apply for it, your credit rating, you're basically opening up your whole life to the national security apparatuses to vet you, make sure that you're trustworthy to have access to classified or sensitive information. I'll just give you a bit of a sample so listeners can understand how many security clearances have been processed alone in the last decade or less, actually since 2016. I put an OPQ in that I got a response to last May. Here's the key departments that applied. D&D, over 65,000 applications for secret level security clearance. How many denied in that time frame? 2.
Oh, wow.
ESDC, 8,916. How many denied? 14. Bank of Canada, 2,400, denied 1. NRCan, 8,900 applied, 6 denied. Overall, just shy of 250,000 officials or bureaucrats, people within the government, applied for security clearances from 2016 to 2023, and only 23 were denied. So that gives you a scope of just how many people have access to this information and how many need to know within the bureaucracy. But as I mentioned earlier, just because you have that security clearance doesn't mean you get access. A good example, during the convoy protests that were occurring here in Ottawa, I still had my top secret security clearance. I maintained that when I released from the Canadian Armed Forces. I made the case in this House. Why, if the government is sort of lacking that trust with the general public and there's concerns over what the threats are, etc., why wouldn't the government share that information with privy councillors, former privy councillors? They already have been vetted, or a number of the members of Parliament here that have a security clearance of some sort. I'm going to skip to the last paragraph of the preamble right now because it sort of fits better in my speech. And whereas Parliament considers that a member of the Senate or the House of Commons must be able to apply for a secret security clearance, and if that member passes the personnel security screening process, to be granted that security clearance. So I just want to make sure this is clear what it is. It means you can apply. It doesn't mean that you're going to pass. And in fact, I would argue there's quite potentially individuals within both our chamber and the other place that may not pass. Who knows why? I don't have access to that information, and frankly, it's none of my business. But most of the time in my past experience where people fail to get security clearances is because they don't really want it, or they're not honest when they're actually doing the process, because that's what the question is. Is there something out there that if a foreign state or somebody could hold over you and basically blackmail you that questions your trustworthiness to have access to that information? But what it isn't. My bill, if it passes, isn't going to guarantee that everybody in this chamber and everybody in the other house or the other place gets access to classified sensitive information, right? That's not what this does. It's the first step in allowing, and I'll get into it, important debate and discussions around issues that are highly sensitive or important. And one other note I'd like to point out is privy councillors, our government themselves, don't actually have security clearances. In fact, I would argue one of the least vetted people, and it's not a shot at our current Prime Minister, that's been vetted is the current Prime Minister, because he had the privilege of becoming the leader of his party and ultimately the Prime Minister without being a former privy councillor. When you're a privy councillor or you're being appointed by the government, by the Prime Minister, to sit as a cabinet member, the system actually vets you. Now, you'd hope that when the current Prime Minister was going through that process, that he was being vetted, and if there was a flag, that the apparatus would have flagged it to the Prime Minister of the day, Mr. Harper, and made if there would have been any issues. But my point is, privy councillors actually don't have a security clearance in the traditional sense for those of us that served in law enforcement or in the military that went through the whole process, or somebody that has had the privilege of sitting on NSICOP, for example. So what are the real risks to my bill? Well, really there are no risks other than the risks of somebody, if they applied, were denied, the political risk to themselves if that information was to ever become public. But again, that's not something that would be released. It's privacy information. It's not actually information that's tied to having access. So why is this so important? The next portion of my preamble gets into, in the face of threats to world peace and security posed by nefarious state and non-state actors, the government of Canada needs to make challenging decisions relating to national security, which it must do in a manner that is consistent with its constitutional duty to be accountable to Parliament and that respects the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights. I'm not going to focus on all the threats. So many committees, including and even the latest government's defense plan update, NSICOP reports, covers the threats. I don't think I need to really explain that. But I want to focus on the accountability and transparency side. So if I just grab from the conclusion part of Top Secret, which is a Top Secret Canada edited by Stephanie Carvin, Thomas Juneau, and Greg Forsyth, the conclusion. I'm going to read a few quotes here. Indeed, the Canadian National Security and Intelligence community as a whole has traditionally not been very transparent, unquote. Next quote. In a democracy, first, transparency is, or should be, an end in itself, unquote. Quote, there is also a strong pragmatic and utilitarian case in favor of greater transparency. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies need the buy-in of society they seek to protect. When they earn the trust of the population, it's far easier to gather information to build and maintain collaborative ties with key communities and ultimately to do their jobs. Yet when security agencies, i.e. the government, are closed and perform poorly in terms of transparency, it is more difficult for citizens to trust them, and it opens space for erroneous information, misperceptions, and conspiracy theories to circulate. This reinforces a dynamic of mistrust and suspicion, unquote. And the final paragraph of that book, Mr. Speaker, quote, a challenge for the government, I would say for Parliament, remains to deepen the public's understanding of the workings of the national security sector. Canadians, and indeed their political leaders, must have the context to avoid swinging wildly from indifference to panic when security events occur. Likewise, transparency and national security literacy help citizens tease apart real scandals from the noise. More generally, Canadians shall need to develop a renewed understanding of the hard dilemmas that frequently arise in securing a free and democratic state. The last couple of preambles, I'm not going to read them all, Mr. Speaker, but they really focus on allowing that access. That's what this speech will do. But again, it talks about two examples under the current government and the previous government. So we got the Winnipeg Lab scandal, and we talk about the Afghan detainee files issues under the previous Harper government. How did Parliament address those issues? They formed ad hoc committees at the last minute, created a lot of, I would say, undue politicizations of that whole process, whereas if we had members already qualified, we'd already, or cleared, we could speed up that process and help downplay the politicization, and we've seen this most recently even with the foreign interference. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I want to get to what PROC passed unanimously last week, their recommendation 3, that the government work with recognized party whips to facilitate security clearances at a secret level or higher of caucus members who are not privy councillors, who shall be taken as satisfying requirements for a need to know to ensure that they may be adequately briefed about the importance of national security matters, including foreign intelligence threat activities directed towards Parliament or the party or its caucus members. So considering that Parliament has already, PROC has already unanimously passed basically what my bill is calling for, I could seek unanimous consent to have my bill just pass at all stages. I won't, because getting back to the most importance of why I'm debating this is to improve the education of Parliament and Canadians. I look forward to any questions that my honourable colleagues may have. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire, the honourable member from Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his rationale that he set out in his bill, and I don't particularly disagree with his important comments about accountability and transparency. I think that would actually go a long way in accomplishing what he set out to do. My question more comes down to the need to know and how that relates to various different operations that might be ongoing. How somebody getting access to information. And if there's too many people with access to that particular information, it could actually end up jeopardizing an ongoing operation. I'm not saying that that's a reason to vote against this, but my question would be, what are his thoughts on that and how we can continue to keep those individuals safe?
The honourable member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
Very valid question, Mr. Speaker. So, look, I highlighted just how many people have security clearances in the country already. Over the last 8+ years, over almost 250,000. The government ministers themselves, and I would argue likely some of the parliamentary secretaries, have the privilege of access to that, a lot of classified sensitive information. NSICOP gets access to things, although they're prevented from accessing ongoing current investigations. And again, ultimately, just because you have it, it gets to my point, it doesn't mean the government has to give it. And when a committee, as a decision makes, let's just use, say, foreign affairs or public safety, makes the case for why they need access and they pass that, that's the will of Parliament. And as I've given a couple of examples of Afghan detainee files, the Winnipeg Lab files, it doesn't mean that they're going to get there. But part of the reason in both those cases the government came up with an ad hoc process was because they said that members of those committees didn't have the appropriate classification. So this helps address that, but ultimately it's on the individuals to protect that information if it could compromise security for the individuals in this country.
The honourable member from Edmonton Strathcona.
I would like to thank my colleague for his intervention today, and I think this bill has some very interesting portions to it. It was interesting to listen to him speaking today. I have received the security clearance because of some of the work that I've done with my other colleagues on the Winnipeg Labs documents. And I recognize his perspective that this does increase transparency. I think it's very, very important to have that there. I also recognize that the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians Act is supposed to have a statutory review every 5 years, and we are 2 years overdue on that. But the question I have for the member, if I could, has he looked at what other countries around the world do? We know that the U.S. has much more oversight, but I'm wondering if he's looked at other G7 countries, other allies, how they deal with this issue.
The honourable member from Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
So I have looked at some of them, but not specifically on this process, because a lot of them it's actually a lot simpler to get a security clearance or access to the information. They have, in general, the UK has a much broader system to allow it. The US, and I'm not proposing we adopt a US system of congressional or senatorial oversight. That's not what I'm suggesting here. I'm just suggesting the first step in a process which would just allows you to apply. As I've mentioned, my bill doesn't guarantee that a member or a senator will actually get that clearance, and it doesn't guarantee that they'll get access. All it's saying is that the government can't use the government of the day, regardless of the political party, can't deny somebody from applying to get a security clearance. That's literally all my bill does.
The honourable member from Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola, on a brief question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just appreciate this member's contribution. Often when people come to this place, they either try to build up the government or build up Parliament. This obviously is building up Parliament. He talked about education, and I know that there's a lot of confusion around oversight and review. To me, this bill just really creates a floor, not a ceiling as to how much. And it's usually ministers that have oversight duties, and it's usually parliamentarians in certain cases that would have the review. Could he explain how this would benefit and to which side?
Brief answer from the honourable member from Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
You know, well, look, great question. My whole point here is to increase that level of education and I would argue parliamentary oversight. I talked at length about accountability and transparency. Ultimately, all of us in this place were elected to represent Canadians. You can't open up, and there's a huge demand. I'm sure you heard it from some of your constituents. The members heard from some of his constituents that the fact that, hey, why can't I know about certain things? Well, in reality, there are legitimate reasons why we need to protect information. I'm just saying here's a way, through a proper process, Parliament can actually get to know this information and hold the government to account and provide greater transparency as we continue to improve national security and intelligence in this country. Thank you.